At this point, I welcome everyone for joining this webinar organized by the NaturaConnect project. Um, Today, we're going to show you a little bit about how we prioritize protected area expansion and other targets of the European biodiversity strategy. This webinar is organized by us, that is IASA, so basically into collaboration with Europark and other partners of the NaturaConnect project. Next slide. Just some general rules for housekeeping. This presentation is recorded, so I hope you agree with this. If you have any questions or comments, please write them directly in the chat, and noting that speaking up is not by default enabled. All presentations and recordings will be made available at the NaturaConnect homepage later on, so you can also look at them and also share them, of course, with other participants or including those in your institution. You're very free to rename your name itself and also state your organization by clicking on the three dots next to your name. And also, please start your camera so you can connect some names to faces, especially if you want to contribute to any discussion later on. Next slide. So for the agenda today, I will first give a very quick short overview of the project goals and what we're trying to achieve today. Also invite you to provide some information about yourself. We also give then an extended overview of the type of methods and how we prioritize for biodiversity and conservation and restoration across Europe. We will then follow on with a bit of feedback on how certain open questions and so on the general methods. And following that, we will do a breakout group discussion. And the breakout group discussion will be actually quite interactive for you because it's not only a discussion, but you will be able to directly comment, visualize, and feedback on the maps that we created. So it provides you an opportunity to directly provide us with some feedback on what you think of the outputs, where you might see challenges, and so forth. After that, we will report back and then follow on by next steps for this year. Next slide. Next. Yeah. Okay. In terms of the overall project, our project, NaturaConnect, is a project of 15 research organizations, 7 policy and conservation organizations, and with 6 case studies distributed at various scales from national to local, but also regional. Our ambition is to create, together with decision makers and stakeholders, that is including you, different knowledge and tools and capacity building to support European member states in realizing a ecological representative and resilient and well-connected network protected areas, what we also call the Trans-European Nature Network. Next slide. This contributes directly to the goals of the European biodiversity strategy, such as to protect at least 30% of the land, with at least 10% under strict protection. And also, we will show you some immediate preliminary results on where targets such as the ecological restoration of 20% of land could be realized across Europe. And we will also show you some indication of where, for instance, ecological corridors across protected areas, but including, for instance, green infrastructure, could be optimally located so that the best benefits for biodiversity could be achieved. Next slide. So before we're going to tell you a little bit how we are going to do all of this, I would ask all of you to participate in a little Menti exercise. Menti is an online tool. You can scan this QR code here or use the menti.com website and enter this code shown on this site. Once you've done this, and maybe we can switch at this point. Yeah, it's also in the chat as just shown there. I think we lost screen. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And you can also scan the code here. And what we would like to ask from you is a little bit to get an indication who you actually represent or where you're coming from. So basically, what is your primary expertise or background more generally? So I see there's already some initial interest coming up with almost equal spread. Almost a completely equal spread. Okay. Conservation takes the lead or other. I like other. That makes it mysterious. Okay. Nah, the biodiversity people. Okay, give it at least 1 or 2 more seconds. Everybody entered. Okay, so it definitely seems like biodiversity and conservation and sites are clearly dominating, at least here in the audience. But there's also a very interesting other group of people, which I hope represent also different interests, particularly in the biodiversity strategy and its realization. So this is something we'll be, of course, very interested to hear your opinion. Next slide. So, and maybe you can also give us a little bit of indication where you're from or which region you're representing. So this could be like different where your institution is based, your home institution, or it could also be like who you're representing. Okay, see, there's some points on the map. Someone living in, which I think is Spitzbergen in the very north. Okay, wow, that looks good. So a strong Iberian grout, and also some bits in Central Europe, Northern Scotland. Excellent. Okay, next slide. We also, this webinar that you're participating in today is actually the second of our webinars that we have hosted. We have hosted a previous webinar as well. And here we would like to ask you, have you participated in this previous webinar? If not, there's no problem. Everything you hear today will not be, dependent on the previous ones. Okay, so we got a lot of newcomers, but also some returning faces, which is great. Okay, next slide. And finally, the final Menti question. Have you participated by any chance in our event in Brussels in January 2026? We organized a larger event where we asked people to see where and how like the Trans-European Nature Network could be realized, and what is your opinions on those? This again is rather just out of our own curiosity, so no worries if you haven't participated. Everything today will of course be fully, stand on its own without prior knowledge. Okay, that is good. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and there's another question. Okay. Um, how familiar are you generally with the NaturaConnect project? Have you heard it before? Um, so I see there is some general familiarity, intermediate. Yeah, so it's about in the medium one. Okay. So it is overwhelming. I say over half deaf people have somehow heard with it before, but there's also some new faces, which is great because then we can show you what we have done, and it would be very interesting, of course, to hear your opinion on that. Okay, back to station. Great. Okay, so this was just a general, just to hear a bit more about you. We mentioned in the slide before that we had a first webinar before. And of course, back then in the first webinar, some of you mentioned to participate in this. Just to let you know what we did with the feedback that you gave us back then since the first webinar. We used this feedback, for instance, to fixing and adjusting certain errors. That helped us quite a lot. We also improved a lot of the parameterization of the prioritization, including what is contained or allocated in terms of area. And we added additional functionality to the feedback gathering tool that you will also see later. So you understand, for instance, why certain sites are selected, which is something that many of you back then highlighted. And we also integrated further data and information where available, such as, for instance, additional land user pressure information. You don't need to look at this now, but there is a recording of the first webinar that we held and also detailed responses. So an Excel sheet where you can see how we responded to all of your comments that you gave us back then. Next slide. And finally, how will your input today that you give us actually help us? Similar as with the first webinar, we show you maps that we developed that identify priority areas where expansion of protection and restoration would provide the biggest benefit for biodiversity. And what we would basically welcome from you is some general feedback on our methods and data and objectives, as well as spatial explicit feedback. So literally you telling us on the map where you see maybe challenges, but also really nice, interesting patterns or ideas how this could be, for instance, valuable for people in your region and the institutions in your regions. Okay, with this, I now give the next slide and I give over to my colleague Louise, who will tell you a little bit about how we actually identify European priority areas.
Thanks, Martin, and hello, everyone. My name is Louise O'Connor, and I'm going to be talking about some methods and preliminary results for European priority areas. Next slide, please. So one of the main questions we're addressing in this project is where to restore and protect ecosystems in Europe. Previous slide. Sorry. So we want to design a trans-European nature network that's comprehensive, resilient, connected, and feasible. So to do that, we consider different types of data that are relevant, including, of course, lots of species and habitats, but also ecosystem services, climate change, connectivity, land use change scenarios, socioeconomic costs, and the notion of area sharing, which is the idea that area allocated for conservation and restoration should be evenly shared between countries in Europe. So the 30%, for example, could be achieved for every country as well as at the European level. And of course, we also consider existing protected areas. And so then we integrate this in the spatial conservation prioritization, and we identify top priority areas in line with the EU biodiversity strategy's targets. So 30% of European land for conservation, 10% for strict protection, 10% for 20% for restoration. And so now let's unpack a little bit every component to better understand what we mean by comprehensive, resilient, and connected. Next slide, please. So first, to ensure the 10N is comprehensive, we focus on all species and habitats that are listed in the nature directives, as well as in the IUCN red lists, and any other endemic species. So we're considering over 1,000 species, primarily terrestrial, also over 200 different habitat types and other important ecosystems like primary and old growth forests, which we know have to be placed under strict protection, and also other carbon-rich ecosystems. And additionally, we also consider a number of regulating and cultural nature's contributions to people. So, for example, carbon storage and sequestration, soil retention, agricultural pest control, and for the cultural side and cultural benefits, more like nature recreation, wildlife watching, and so on. Next slide, please. And so that requires data on where biodiversity is distributed across Europe. And so in the project, we're using species and habitat distribution models, otherwise known as SDMs. And so these models combine the known occurrences for species and habitats and combine them with environmental conditions where the species is known to occur to predict where a species could live even in areas where no one has sampled. And so the advantage of that is that we get fine resolution data at 1 square kilometer, and we can also project these distributions in future climate scenarios. Next slide, please. Moving on to resilience, climate resilience is explicitly stated in the European Biodiversity Strategy as something that is important for conservation and restoration planning. And in the project, we explicitly account for this in the design of priority areas. And so we use future projections of species distributions onto future climate change scenarios to identify climate refugia for species which are part of the species distribution that will remain suitable and valuable under future climates. And so this allows for the mapping of climate resilient areas. Next, please. that are important for biodiversity conservation in both current and future climatic condition. And we then use that as an input in the prioritization. Next slide, please. And resilience, of course, is also interconnected with the idea of connectivity. That will allow species to move across the continent and track their climatic niche. So conserving and restoring connectivity across Europe is really essential for species movements and for tracking climate change. And so we use omnidirectional connectivity models that help us identify where wildlife movements are compressed or channelized in corridors in Europe. And then these corridors can then be prioritized for conservation and restoration planning. So then we use the connectivity results into spatial conservation planning. Next slide, please. So once we have all of this data on species, connectivity, climate resilience, how actually do we identify priority areas for conservation and restoration? A widely established method to do that is spatial conservation prioritization, which aims to identify a set of key irreplaceable and complementary areas that maximize gains for every species and habitat across their geographic range. Let's see how it works with an example. Next, please. Where we have 4 sites and 4 species distributed across these sites, and we want to know which one of these we should prioritize for protection. So the first thing to note is that 2 of these species, the frog and the snake, only occur in one location. So if we lose either of those sites, B and C, we would lose our only chance to protect these species. So those 2 sites are of higher priority. Next, please. If we can only protect one site, we would go for site C primarily, because protecting it would also protect another species, so we get more benefit for biodiversity per area. And our next priority would then be the site with the endemic snake. And then if we wanted to protect all 3 species across the network, we would have to protect another third site, A or D. So we can see here with this example that it's not just about species richness. Highly valuable and irreplaceable sites are not always the most species rich. It's more about irreplaceability and complementarity. Next slide, please. So yeah, a key concept is complementarity, and especially we want priority areas to complement existing protected areas so that we can reduce gaps in coverage for underprotected species and habitats and maximize the representativeness of the overall protected area network. Next slide, please. And sometimes we also value certain biodiversity features more than others. For example, threatened species might be more critical to protect, or carbon-rich ecosystems might be more essential to protect. And we can use weights to shape the prioritization and prioritize certain species and habitats. Next, please. And so in the example, we could find priority areas quite easily by hand, but of course, real-world conservation planning problems are much more complex. In Europe, we have 5 million square kilometers and thousands of species and habitats. So to solve this problem, we need to rely on conservation planning software. You may be familiar with some of them, Zonation, Marksan, and Prioritizer. So here we use Prioritizer. That really enable to optimize gains for thousands of species and habitats across their geographic range under limited resources. And this is important because resources and space for conservation and restoration are limited, and we need to make sure that we're choosing the right places that will be most effective for restoring and halting the loss of biodiversity. Next, please. And there's not just one single possible configuration of what a trans-European nature network could look like. So we've created different scenarios which vary in terms of different planning criteria. I won't go through all of the variations today, but next slide, please. Today, we'll just focus on a subset of these scenarios that we think are the most policy relevant. So we're looking at 12 different scenarios for conservation, restoration, and strict protection that ensure that these areas are shared evenly between countries, We also account for all protected areas as the baseline to reach 30%. And then the scenarios vary in whether or not to consider climate change explicitly, whether or not to consider connectivity explicitly, and then which nature's values to focus on primarily. Do we want to focus on species and habitats only, or do we want to also secure benefits for society like carbon sequestration or benefits for culture as well? Next slide, please. So yeah, this is the result of the European-wide prioritisation for 30%, ensuring that every country gets 30% while coordinating at the European level. And on the map, the priority areas in pink expand on existing protected areas in grey. And here, the priority areas minimise gaps in coverage for species and habitats. They are complementary to each other and expand on existing protected areas. And here in this map, we only focus on species and habitats in the current climate change conditions. Next, please. So these sites are really important in terms of endemic species. They're quite irreplaceable. If we could take a look at some examples, for example, in Doñana in southwest Spain, we can have very unique species at the European level, like the Iberian lynx and the marble duck. And another example in the Alps, you have equally endemic species that are adapted to alpine environments, like the alpine bumblebees or the ibex. Next slide, please. And perhaps more important than the map itself is to quantify the actual gains in terms of the distributions that would be covered additionally for habitats and species with these new priority areas. So for example, here, what you see on the bar chart is that for habitats, we would go from 37% of their distributions protected on average to 53% with the new priority areas. And for species, we go from 30% that are currently protected to 40% in the priority areas. So these are really substantial gains, considering that this is just for 5% of European land. Next, please. So with just 5% of additional area in the right places, we can have large gains for species and habitats in these irreplaceable areas, as well as also securing benefits for carbon, rich ecosystems, and other nature's contributions to people. Next slide, please. So moving on to the priorities for 10% strict protection. Next, the first question is, what can we consider to be currently under strict protection? So here we consider the IUCN protected area management categories 1 and 2 as being strictly protected, and we use this as a baseline to reach 10%. Next. The second criteria is that the 10% are included within the 30%, so it necessarily includes upgrading existing protected areas to stronger levels of protection. And we also implement a core and buffer spatial structure when possible, so that the strict priorities would be surrounded by non-strict areas. And then a third criteria, next please, is that the 10% are among the 30%, those with the highest biodiversity value for species and habitats, including for carbon-rich ecosystems like old-growth forests and peatlands, and areas of high ecological integrity. And so with these criteria, this is what the map would look like, and this is one of just many scenarios and approaches to strict protection. We've explored other scenarios as well. And again, this is just looking at species and habitats in the current climate conditions and not considering future climate change or connectivity. Next slide, please. And so on the Priority Check platform online that you will see in the breakout groups, you'll be able to look at this scenario in this map. So you'll see expansion priorities for 30% in red, in blue for 10% that upgrade existing protected areas, and in purple would be priorities for 10% that are new designations. And yeah, so this map is only based on biodiversity in current climate conditions, but we also have developed scenarios that include climate change. Next slide, please. And so this would be the resulting map from the prioritization, considering climate change resilience. And so this is another map that you will see on the platform online later. You would have Priority areas for conservation, 30% in red, and in blue for strict protection. And then we also distinguish between protected areas that overlap with the most important areas for climate resilience in future climates. And so with this scenario, we've found that with just, again, 5% of additional land in Europe, this scenario will protect 55% of the most important areas for climate resilience, compared with just 33% that are included within the current protected areas. And this is also an increase compared with a scenario where climate change is not explicitly integrated. Next slide, please. And once we have all these scenarios that I mentioned earlier, the 12 scenarios, we can also look at which areas are always selected across different scenarios. And so that allows us to identify consensus areas that are of high importance across all planning criteria, so including species and habitats, but also cultural and regulating benefits, climate change and connectivity. And so this is another of the maps that you will see in the platform online, where blue areas represent priorities for strict protection, red areas for 30% conservation, and with shades and a color gradient that shows the level of consensus between different scenarios. And so the darker areas kind of represent more safe bet areas for expansion, because they have consistently have high value across all scenarios. Next, please. And we also developed priority areas for 20% restoration, and we defined them as being areas that are currently degraded, but that can be restored, and that would have the top 20% highest potential value for species and habitats if restored. Next, please. And so for this, we account for the potential value for species, habitats, and nature contributions to people, land use and land use change scenarios, as well as existing protected areas. Next, please. And we allow restoration to occur both within and outside existing protected areas. Within, because we know that by 2030, a lot of restoration efforts should happen within existing protected areas, but bearing in mind that with the outlook to 2030, 2050, we also need to restore outside of existing protected areas. And so this is a map that you will also see online, again, with a distinction between whether restoration priorities are identified within protected areas or outside of protected areas, and with the shades, so darker areas representing higher consensus across all scenarios. Next, please. So now that we have the maps and some first results, we would really welcome some feedback on them. And so you'll have the opportunity today to provide feedback on them during the breakout groups using the Priority Check platform. Next, please, where you will see the maps and what they mean in the legend, and then you'll be able to click and provide some comments on these locations. Next, please. And we also have another platform that we're developing, NaturaConnect, where you'll be able to navigate and explore all of the different various scenarios that we've been developing, and this will be publicly launched later this year. Next, please. And yes, with that, I'm done, and yeah, happy to take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Louise. So we have a little bit of time allocated for general questions on the methods itself, that and everything you've heard so far. I already see some of you being active in chat, which is great, but in case someone wants to speak up and let us know about some general opinions or general points of interest and relevance, and so we would have some time now. I see there is one hand up already from Friedrich Wolf. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thanks for this overview. I was just wondering, is it possible in the breakout groups to focus on a certain region, because our expertise is maybe not evenly spread? And I have to say, I'm particularly intrigued by the focus you did in the presented maps and on large parts of Switzerland where I'm involved. So it would be good to connect your results with the discussion that's happening here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, we will have different breakout groups by biogeographical regions. So basically, you're open to allocate yourself, for instance, to Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, or the Mediterranean region, and so forth. That being said, any layers that you will see online later that you can actively navigate and provide feedback on will be shown for all of Europe. So you can zoom to any regions you're particularly familiar with as well. Although we would recommend to, or would basically ask you to provide primarily feedback on the regions that you're joining so that we also get some geographic equal spread of feedback received. But yes, Switzerland should be there. Any further general questions? Francisco.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Luis, for these summaries. Really impressive work. Just one short clarification. Of course, you did not have time to go through details, but when you assessed restoration, you meant your point of departure were degraded areas. Can you shortly describe what criteria were used to define degraded areas? Thanks.
Francisco. Yeah, oops, sorry. So we just took essentially the land use intensity levels that have been developed in the project by the team at FUA in Amsterdam. So basically, any area that is dominated by extractive, productive land use, like medium to high intensity cropland, grassland, and forestry, would be considered to be potentially degraded in the sense that it can be de-intensified and with a return to more natural land systems. Of course, this doesn't account for things like pollution, which are not really totally captured with the land use change, but it's just a start. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add, restoration, although we also show you restoration results, we see it also as a complementarity to the overall biodiversity strategy. And by far, there are many more nuances in terms of restoration because it's, as you might know, it's a quite complicated topic itself as well. Any further questions? Maybe give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think there are no more general questions. There's a question in chat. Can we have the presentation? Yes, I think this should be possible. We can provide a PDF. This presentation itself is also be recorded and will be also, accessible later. So this should be perfectly fine. Okay, so if there are no more general questions on the methods itself, then I think we can actually proceed to the actual, and I think I'm sensing this as a sign that everyone is very keen to look at the maps now. So this is why we're now progressing to the next part of our webinar, which is the interactive part. As mentioned before, we want to get spatial explicit feedback on the expansion priorities. So we just asked you about the overall feedback that you might have, but we also want to get it directly on the maps. For this purpose, we have developed an online platform to gather your feedback, which is like you can access this directly in the browser on your computer. So there is no installation or anything like that. The platform shows both the prepared versions of the priority maps that Luis showed earlier, and they are very specifically colored so that, for instance, different protection, restoration, expansion priorities are directly visited. And we want you essentially, or we would really encourage you to directly leave comments on the map itself. So the purpose is really you can go on the map and basically click on certain areas and leave, for instance, this area looks good, or I have a problem here because of X, Y, or it would be good to know more why this was selected, or etc. So we would really welcome your feedback in various dimensions. And you will also get some overarching questions later, which will help you a little bit to guide like what we can gather from you. I should emphasize that the platform itself does not record any personal data. So in case you want, for instance, let us know who entered it, we will see that later. We would encourage you to leave, for instance, a name when you log in. So that helps us, for instance, to identify specific. If not, if you would rather stay anonymous, this is also perfectly fine. And all feedback entered and the information is only saved for basically for the purpose of us improving the maps itself, and also emphasizing that any outputs of NaturaConnect, so all the maps that you will see today, we will all make them publicly available for download. So meaning you can essentially, by the feedback you're providing to us, you help us improve our maps, but ultimately you might also improve the usefulness of our maps for your own work and your own region. So this is definitely something I think which I hope you find also useful. Next slide. So in terms of the different variants, what we call like variants that we will explore today of protected area prioritizations, we will focus on a total of 7 in total, but focusing on primarily on the top 5 that are listed here. One is on biodiversity only, which, for instance, where any priorities you see are purely driven by species and habitats without any further constraints or climate change or similar. One is on climate resilient expansion priorities, which particular emphasis on the climate resilience of the protected areas in terms of future climates. You can already see the difference here and the nuances and how this will change allocations in areas. One will show you the protect priorities for 30% as well as 10% directly on top of it. And one focusing more specifically on strict protection. The difference here to the previous one is here that here the differentiation is even being made by whether strict protection is a complete new designation or whether it's an upgrade of existing protected areas, for instance, to strict protection. One is focusing on restoration priorities. As discussed before, this will show you the 20% restoration priorities across Europe and what is essentially whether it's restored inside or outside protected areas. Then there are 2 additional optional maps that if we have time in the breakout groups, we can also go through them. One is showing the overall 10N. This shows not only the protection priorities, but actually show, for instance, also the corridors between them that connecting these protected areas to across green infrastructure. And one is called land use challenges, where we essentially show the 30% protection priorities, but also give a little bit more information to color codes that show you certain areas that might be bit more challenging in certain countries to implement simply because they overlap with a high proportion of more intensive or medium to intensive anthropogenically modified land, such as pastures or croplands or high intensity forest plantations. Next slide. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly show you a slide of priority check so that you guide you a little bit how it will look like. You will see this later in the breakout groups as well. Next slide. So what you will see in the online tool is essentially a big map in the center and a various set of UI elements on the different left and right. Next. In the UI elements here, you will see various quite important fields. On the right side, you will see there's this field called layer selection. Here, you will see all the layers I just mentioned, and you can iterate to all of them. Basically, select the ones where you think your feedback will be quite helpful, valuable. We would welcome feedback on all of them, of course. This is up to you. And in the breakout group discussion, we will also try to go to all of them, just to show you a bit like the different patterns. Depending on the feedback that we got from the first webinar, many of the first participants back then were interested in why certain areas were selected. We implemented a query function now. When you toggle this query function, this little symbol there, you will see that basically a little pop-up opens that shows you the specific features such as species or habitats that might be contained in a given area, therefore giving you direct feedback on why it was selected in our work. On the left side, you will see this on the very left side of the screen here, you will see this click to add feedback. And this is the most important bits. There are 3 symbols. One is on the points, one on a rectangle, and one on any free drawn polygon. To these buttons, you're able to draw directly on the map. When you click these buttons and click on the map, you will see that a pop-up opens, and the pop-up then basically asks you to see either whether you agree or disagree with a certain area selection and what the specific feedback would be. And there you're welcome to enter any kind of text or feedback. Below this, you will also see some a little bit more grayed out buttons, but they will be visible. Here, you can either move feedback around in space that you might have previously entered, or you can delete previously entered feedbacks if you somehow disagreed again or with yourself. Basically, it was maybe a mistake. That's no problem. And in the bottom left, you will see a legend that shows the overall color codes and what they mean in the maps itself, and the map itself, of course, being in the center. One important point to note is that when you toggle on the query mode on the right, the feedback will be automatically disabled. So in case you're not able to enter feedback, it might be because the toggle mode is on. So, but you will see this. It should be relatively intuitively. And finally, the most important thing, on the top in the bottom right, you will see this field with show feedback. Here you have three options. One is showing the feedback you have entered so far. One is downloading the feedback for yourself, maybe for later or just for record, or maybe even for sending it us. And the last one, and this is for us the most convenient and also most relevant one, is the save feedback button. When you click the save feedback button, it creates a copy of all the feedback you've entered on our server. So basically, it will save it internally. So, and we would really, if you enter feedback, please remember at the end of your session to always click this green button so that basically your feedback is not lost. So don't just close your tab in your browser, but always remember to click the save feedback button. You're welcome to click that save feedback button multiple times. This is no problem. If you have entered feedback before this, it should basically override in the same session always the last feedback that was received. Okay, next slide. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna split in different breakout groups. We are thinking broadly of 6 different breakout groups, which are themed a little bit about overall themes. One, for instance, more the international, one focus on Northern Europe, as you see also on the left, different countries, one on Western Europe, one on the West Mediterranean, one on Central and Eastern Europe, and one on the Eastern Mediterranean Balkans. So we would ask you that you join the Zoom breakout groups for the region that you know personally best. So, for instance, where you already have some previous knowledge of the region, or you're very familiar with the biodiversity strategy or other targets and highlights there. We will assess how many people join each breakout group, and if there may be also synergies. That's something we will see then. Okay, next slide. So in the breakout groups, the first 3 things that you should do is first get a bit familiar with the tool. So for instance, maybe zoom in and out, maybe adding some feedback, or maybe also try out the query function. In each breakout group, there will be a facilitator that will guide you to the session. And as said before, please remember to always save at the end. It would be really a pity if you entered very valuable feedback for us and then it's not saved. So always click the green button at the end. Friedrich, yeah, I see a question.
Yes, just a brief question. Are we expected to stick with the same breakout group all the time, or can we switch if we want?
I think it would be preferable if you stick with the same breakout group during the session. But again, in the breakout group itself, the layers that you will see will show all of Europe. So basically, even if you, let's say, are in the Western European breakout group, you're very welcome to also provide feedback on Mediterranean regions if you know them, right? So basically, it's not limited really. It's more the breakout group teams is more for us to have an equal spread of feedback easily. But if you want to give feedback on other regions beyond your own breakout group, that's perfectly fine, of course. Okay, next slide. So now we're gonna go into the individual breakout groups. My colleague will now open the breakout groups itself. And you will see in the chat and here on the slide itself a link. This is prioritycheck.iasa.ac.at. Once you open this link, there will be a pop-up that asks you for a username. It would be helpful for us if you enter like a username that somehow is identifying yourself, but you can enter anything you like, really. It's not a strict requirement. There's a password, and the password is PA, as in protected area, PA. We're quite short. The feedback platform will remain accessible for 3 weeks after this webinar. So in case you find yourself, you have a lot of feedback to give, or you would rather investigate much more in detail, you're also welcome to look at it later in the after the webinar itself. This is not a problem. Okay, now we're gonna split in different breakout groups, and I hope all of you have a few questions and have a few signs of interest and so forth. So looking welcome to discuss with all of you. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Again, I don't know what was in the other breakout groups yet, but just let me emphasize again, we realize very much that these are a lot of maps. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of different information that is being shown. And as shown here also on the slide, the platform, this feedback platform, will remain open after this webinar, and you're welcome to forward it, for instance, to colleagues in other institutes or institutions that you're working with, who can also invited to enter feedback here. Any feedback we would be very welcome on the specific layers. We heard, for instance, in my breakout group, we heard a little bit that maybe some protected areas might be missing that are not already considered in our analysis. So this is exactly what we were looking after. So please, if you can, directly leave feedback on the map for us, because that is really for us the most helpful information, because then we can directly fact check and so and so we can check what in our data maybe might be wrong or might have been missing and so forth. Okay, next slide. So we would like to do a short little overall reporting back session with you again. Here we go back again to our Menti that I showed before. And in this Menti, basically, what we would ask of you is, what is your overall impression of the results? And what knowledge that we presented might be useful to you, but we didn't show anything about this. And maybe, yeah, Mattea can go again to our Menti. Okay, so for the first question, what is your overall impression of the results, the usefulness? So very much feel free to leave any general comments or remarks. We can also, after this Menti session, you can also welcome to speak them out or tell us a bit more about your views. This is also perfectly fine. As for one first comment, it's very useful to helping us to move at speed. That is excellent during a biodiversity crisis. The tool is intuitive. Oh, that's very nice to hear. I programmed it, so yes. But need more time to look at details. Yes, fully understand. Please do so later. The more, the better. Policy discussions and flexible. Also great to hear. Very useful. Yes, that is great. More connection to other Google pages is useful. Yeah, we had this in our breakout groups. I also actually show myself what some of the species were, so it's good for you to check. Issue with the resolution on some specific areas. Definitely a shortcoming, I guess, because we obviously need to work at a certain area, so to be not over-representing some of our data, because we can only go so far with the data that we have. Useful with getting into small local spatial scales. Yeah, this is again the data issue, I think. To make like really precise local and regional planning, I think the aim here would be really to use localized data rather than pan-European data as we do in our analysis. So we are a bit hesitant to basically do much finer analysis, because it would also just overrepresent what we have in data and the patterns that we would see. Ability to make the layers translucent would be helpful. Yes, understand. This was a very good comment, and something I might even add to the platform after this. Good for an overview, but would need more time for sure. Useful and needs to be implemented to policies. Yes, definitely. Interesting, great work. Great. Useful tools would be good to allow to get summary results across the layers for select or cross layers. Okay. At the moment with the query tool, you can only click individual grid cells, and then there's a button to export them. So basically, you can download all the features, so the species and habitats in there. But for multiple ones, this is not implemented, I think. But if you're interested in general patterns across layers, then just send us a mail and we're happy to extract you something as well. This should be possible. First overview for more detailed study. Exactly, yes. Again, what we've shown you here is not meant to replicate or replace any more local detailed planning you might have in your very specific area. It's more providing a consistent view across Europe and how different countries could actually share and towards the implementation of the biodiversity strategy. More understanding the methodology, also helpful. We can share some of the methodology information underlying this. This is all public on the NaturaConnect websites. Borders of countries, yeah, bit visualization, they might be in there. Taking pretty. Also compare this worker map and natural capital indices. Oh, in Scotland. Oh, this is interesting. Yes. Yeah, we if there's some cross fertilization or can maximize a bit the impact of this, or you have some ideas, this would of course be very much welcome. And otherwise, there's some feedbacks on specific Alpine priorities and regional use. Yes. Yeah. So again, it's of course with every map. I mean, many of you might notice with larger maps, once you zoom in, you will always be there is something that might be more specially resolved if we would like make a very targeted view on this area. But we're looking here really also at the different patterns across scale, across different layers and targets and biodiversity strategies. Then there's more names of places and so forth. Okay, maybe we can, go for the next slide. Yeah. What knowledge that we presented today would have been relevant to you and that what not presented? So we're not looking at what you've seen, but actually maybe you've missed something. You were really joining this webinar and expecting to hear more about X, for instance. If there's something that would be useful for us and we have capacity to show this then would be good to know. Uncertainty. Good point. There's, of course, uncertainty in all the data. These are modeled results. So basically, it's a very robust methodology. But of course, there's uncertainty in any of the model predictions. You might have seen in the maps, there were in some of these consensus layers that you've seen, they're colored in different color gradients. And usually, this can also be interpreted in a way that the darker the color, the more a safe bet area is that across our layers. But of course, it does not consider per se the uncertainty in the data itself. Otherwise, people are good. Give it a few more seconds to add the WMS VDPA layer could be toggled on off. Good idea. Need to check if UNIP WSMC provides this layer that it can be added. If there's a technical facility, I can add this. This is no problem. But yeah, this the details, the cherry on the cake. Yes, it does. Okay, there seems to be a internal. Perfect. Okay, more time to look. That is perfectly fine. Okay, more possible anthropogenic conflicts other than agriculture, tourism, water management, dams, transportation corridors. Yes, this is a good point. We were focusing in our work primarily on impacts of climate change and land use. Other parts of the analysis, for instance, the connectivity analysis that you might have seen. There's this one layer which also has the corridors. Also included, for instance, corridors and barriers to connectivity in the analysis. So this way is included. And then we also consider, for instance, dams in some other analysis that were not shown today. For instance, we also have a similar effort on freshwater connectivity and riverine areas, and there it is included, but not in the layers today. Marine would be amazing, I agree, but unfortunately we are fully focusing terrestrial. There are sister projects on marine, though. Satellite layers, good point. See, there's lots of good tips for me to improve the platform further. But yeah, I can see if we can add this. Yes. Okay. I see it rather slows down. No larger typing comment more. Sync. Okay, we can close this, I think, then. Okay, back to the slides. So you have some of you already provided feedback to us now. So maybe first before we go here, is there any overall comment or other feedback that someone would like to give, like some?
I can say a few words about my breakout group.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, I think everyone really enjoyed it and they were engaged. I guess, systemic comment was that some areas might be commission errors because there is intensive agriculture there. For example, greenhouses in Doñana and in southern Portugal. So something that we need to look into.
Mm-hmm. Frederik?
Yeah, just briefly on the last layer, I didn't quite get that, what the thinking about that was. It's about land use and somehow land use challenges. And looking at the Alps, you have mostly top priority for 30% expansion. I mean, I see the legend, you have a more differentiated approach for other areas, but yeah, maybe you can explain a bit what the thinking is about that.
Yeah, good point. I can start and then give to my colleague Luis. Generally, in this work, we used a European-wide land system maps that was produced by one of our partner. This land system map differentiates between land use and different forms of intensity. For instance, low intensity agriculture, medium intensity, and very intense agriculture. This last layer that you've shown or that you've seen, the idea here is basically to look at some of the expansion priorities and where they might still overlap with, for instance, more intense agriculture according to the land use layer that we used in our analysis. And this gives, for instance, might give some hint, look basically where possible implementation challenges might persist because there is already a lot of agriculture in this area going on that's rather intensive. So it might be quite challenging actually to do a very efficient protected area expansion in this area due to possibly resistance of displacing some of these activities. But this is more like you could think of it as like a risk map. And if you think, for instance, for Switzerland, there were some patterns that might not match your experience or they might all be very intensively used and so forth. We, of course, very much are welcome to hear about it. So also as feedback. Luis, anything I forgot to say here?
I think you said it all, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Just to reiterate that it's basically an overlap between the priorities we've identified and the land systems map for a bunch of high to medium intensity land uses. But yeah, Martin has said it all.
Okay. Any more general questions? Okay. Then I think we can close from here. So basically what you see in this slide, this is just a general indication what happens from now on. As mentioned before, the platform will remain open for 3 more weeks at least, so until mid-April. And you're very welcome to forward it to colleagues in the institution or other partners in different regions that are familiar with certain biodiversity strategy targets, essentially, or certain regions itself. We will utilize all the feedbacks entered and summarize them, so anonymously. So even if you entered your institution or your name, we will easily not share this information, so who entered this information later on. So you don't have any fear that we are kind of revealing your disagreement with certain patterns and so forth. Don't worry. It's if you choose to enter a name in the feedback doing login in the platform, it's primarily for us to also connect maybe different faces or different emails that we can contact you directly, maybe for specific follow-up questions. But otherwise, we will summarize all these feedbacks thematically and also investigate it spatially. So, for instance, where certain things might be off or where something might be missing at this scale, we investigate and where it can be useful. We provide these responses to each of them anonymized. They will be on the NaturaConnect website afterwards, so you can look at them as well, like how we respond to each of the comments that you've gave us and what we plan to do about it. And then also we will use this, of course, to identify also maybe commonalities and maybe there are consensus areas that are emerging. So maybe you will find out that with number of people commenting on certain areas, like for instance, I realized that the Alps might be, for instance, quite obviously very highlighted as expansion priorities across layers. So if there's something that comes up here, then it would be also we will probably also use describe some of this in a report from our project. So for instance, where there might be certain feedback that is emerges of general consensus or uncertainty or disagreement, of course. We will let everyone who signed up to this webinar know of the outcomes of what you have seen today and how we summarize this. And we will do this by May. We're doing this by May because we also need to, of course, investigate ourselves and also write up some of the responses and the summary there. Okay, next slide. And with that, I think we can close today's webinar. So you're very welcome to connect with us for basically across the project. We have a range of different social media channels. We also have a website where, for instance, a lot of methodological information is presented. So if you wondered, for instance, where does the biodiversity data come from, or where does the land use information come from, you will find the information there, but for instance, the text that describes deliverable, you will find the data itself there. So you can actually get a link to our Zenodo page where you can literally download the individual TIFF files as well for many of the layers. The layers that you're shown today will also be shown there at some point, later point. And finally, at the last slide, this is something that would be quite important for us as well. And I think my colleagues will put that in the chat now too. We would be very much happy if you could provide us also some general feedback with this, how this webinar was organized and so forth, or if you had a good opportunity to engage and so forth in this questionnaire. This is in chat, and I think it might, we will also circulate it after the webinar in a mail. And next slides, which is the last one. Yeah, there's again on this little QR code, you will find this survey that we just posted in chat. If there's no more comments or anything closing, then I'm very happy to close the webinar. And thank you all very much for attending. And yeah, please leave plenty bountiful comments on the maps. Say us whatever you think. And it can be good or bad, definitely. We also very much welcome about good comments. So don't criticize only. Unless you want to, of course.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.